Walter Hayes had $17 left to his name, and exactly 48 hours before the HOA legally erased him from existence. Not evicted. Not removed. Erased. That's the word written in the final notice nailed to his door in aggressive red ink. The neighbors whispered about it like it was some kind of execution date, but Walter didn't react the way a desperate man should. He didn't panic. He didn't argue. He didn't even look surprised. He just stood there for a long second, staring at the paper, then slowly smiled, like someone who had just been given confirmation of something he'd been waiting for. Because the truth was, Walter Hayes had already lost everything worth losing years ago. And what the HOA was about to take from him, wasn't something they actually understood. He was 74, but he didn't look fragile. He looked empty. The kind of empty that doesn't come from age, but from experience. His face carried the weight of decades that no one in that perfectly polished neighborhood could even begin to imagine. Same routine every day. Same broken chair on the porch. Same cheap coffee in a chipped mug. Same distant stare at the street like he was watching ghosts instead of people. To everyone else, he was just the poor old man who couldn't keep up. The last leftover piece of a neighborhood that had already been replaced. But they were wrong. Completely wrong. Walter wasn't left behind. He had simply chosen to stay, long after everyone else had forgotten why this place mattered. The neighborhood itself had become something else entirely. It wasn't a community anymore, it was a controlled environment. Perfect lawns trimmed to identical lengths. Houses painted in approved shades. Trash cans hidden within exactly 30 minutes of collection. Every detail monitored. Every imperfection punished. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Mercer. HOA president, self-appointed guardian of standards, and a man who treated rules like weapons rather than guidelines. Early 40s, sharp jawline, always dressed like he was one meeting away from something important. People respected him, or at least pretended to. Because Daniel didn't just enforce rules. He enforced control. And Walter's house was the only thing he couldn't control. Peeling paint curled off the wooden panels like scars that refused to heal. The lawn wasn't destroyed, just natural. Uneven. Alive. The mailbox leaned slightly to the left, like it had simply gotten tired of standing straight after all these years. To the HOA, it was an embarrassment. To Daniel, it was a problem that needed to be eliminated. But to Walter, it was history. Every crack, every imperfection, every faded color held something that couldn't be replaced. And that's exactly why he refused to change it. The first fine had been small. $50. Lawn maintenance violation. Walter paid it the next morning without saying a word. Then came another. And another. Each one faster than the last, like someone was testing how far they could push before he broke. Within weeks, the tone shifted. The numbers climbed. The language hardened. What started as requests turned into demands. And then finally, into threats. Over $3,000 in fines stacked up against a man who barely had enough to buy groceries. And then Walter stopped paying. That's when Daniel made it personal. The final notice wasn't mailed. It wasn't emailed. It was delivered by hand, aggressively nailed into Walter's front door in broad daylight, as if it was meant to be seen. As if it was meant to send a message to everyone watching from behind their curtains. Daniel stood there for a moment after hammering it in, arms crossed, scanning the street with quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just enforcement. This was a demonstration. Power, displayed publicly. The door opened slowly. Walter stepped out, his movement calm, controlled, almost precise. His eyes didn't go to Daniel first. They went to the notice. He read every word carefully, like it mattered. Like he was memorizing it. Then, his gaze shifted. For the first time in years, he looked directly at someone. Straight at Daniel. And in that moment, something changed. "Are you absolutely certain you want to go through with this?" Walter's voice was low, steady, and completely free of fear. No anger. No desperation. Just a quiet weight behind every word that didn't belong to a man in his position. Daniel let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You've had more chances than you deserved. This is over." Walter held his gaze for a second longer. Then nodded. Slowly. Accepting something, or maybe confirming it. "All right," he said softly. "Then whatever happens next, make sure you remember this moment." Daniel frowned slightly. What is that supposed to mean? But Walter didn't answer. He stepped back inside. And closed the door. That should have been the end of it. That's what everyone expected. A quiet old man finally giving in. Packing his things. Disappearing like he had always been invisible. But that night, something changed. The lights in Walter's house didn't turn off. Not at midnight. Not at 2 in the morning. Not even at 4. And just before sunrise, something else happened. For the first time in over 30 years. Walter Hayes opened a locked metal box hidden beneath his floorboards. Inside it, was a past the HOA was never supposed to uncover. Walter didn't rush. He never rushed. Even now, as the entire neighborhood slept peacefully, believing the problem had already been solved. Walter moved with the same slow, deliberate precision he had carried for decades. But this wasn't weakness. This wasn't age. This was control. The wooden floor beneath his feet creaked softly as he walked toward the far corner of the living room, a place so ordinary that no one would ever think to look twice. No furniture. No decoration. Just an old rug that had been sitting there for years, collecting dust. Like everything else in the house. Walter bent down. Not struggling. Not hesitating. He rolled the rug aside. Underneath it, the floor looked identical to the rest. Same wood. Same worn-out texture. Same faded color. But only to someone who didn't know what they were looking for. Walter did. His fingers moved across the surface slowly, counting the panels without looking. 1. 2. 3, until they stopped. A faint click. Barely audible. But real. He pressed down. And a hidden section of the floor lifted slightly, just enough to reveal a thin, dark line beneath it. Walter slid his hand into the gap, and pulled. The panel came loose. And underneath it, was a small, black metal box. No dust. No rust. Perfect condition. Like it hadn't aged a single day, unlike everything else in the house. Walter stared at it for a moment. Not with surprise. Not with nostalgia. But with recognition. Like this wasn't something from his past. This was something he had been waiting to use again. He lifted it carefully and placed it on the table. For a few seconds, he didn't open it. He just stood there, looking at it, as if opening it would change something permanently. Then finally, he unlocked it. Inside, wasn't money. It wasn't documents. It wasn't anything a poor old man should have. It was something far worse. A collection of neatly organized files, each labeled with names. Addresses. Dates. Photos. And at the very top was a file that hadn't been there by accident. Daniel Mercer. Walter's fingers rested on it for a second longer than the others. Then he picked it up. Opened it. And quietly began to read. Miles away, in a modern, perfectly lit bedroom, Daniel Mercer was asleep, completely unaware that his name had just been pulled from a box that was never meant to be opened again. On his nightstand sat his phone. Silent. Still. Until suddenly. It vibrated. Once. Then again. Daniel shifted slightly but didn't wake up. The screen lit up. Unknown number. A new message appeared. No greeting. No warning. Just one line. You should have left the house alone. Back inside Walter's home, the atmosphere had changed. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It felt active. Like something had started. Walter turned the page slowly. Each detail inside the file was precise. Calculated. Not random information, but collected evidence. Years of it. Financial records. Property transfers. Private complaints buried and silenced. Even photos, of moments Daniel would swear had never been seen by anyone. Walter didn't react. He didn't look shocked. Because nothing inside that file was new to him. He already knew everything. This wasn't discovery. This was confirmation. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up expecting routine. Clean streets. Quiet mornings. Normal life. But at exactly 8:12 a.m. something unusual happened. Daniel stepped out of his house, dressed like always, confident like always. But something was off. His movements weren't as sharp. His expression wasn't as controlled. He checked his phone again. That message was still there. No number. No trace. No explanation. Just that one line. Repeating in his mind. You should have left the house alone. Across the street. Walter was already sitting on his broken chair. Same posture. Same coffee. Same distant expression. But this time. He wasn't looking at the street. He was looking at Daniel. And for the first time. There was something behind his eyes. Not sadness. Not emptiness. Something much colder. Something calculated. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. And for a brief second. Their eyes met. Walter didn't look away. Didn't blink. Didn't react. He just held that stare, like he already knew how this would end. And that's when Daniel felt it. Not fear. Not yet. But something close to it. A crack. Small. But real. Because what Daniel didn't understand yet was that this was never about fines. Never about the house. And definitely never about money. He hadn't just pushed out a poor old man. He had triggered something that had been buried for decades. And now, it was awake. The next morning didn't feel normal, even though everything looked exactly the same. The lawns were still perfectly trimmed, the houses still identical, the silence still controlled, but something invisible had shifted. Daniel Mercer felt it the moment he stepped outside. That message hadn't left his mind. It wasn't just the words, it was the certainty behind them. Whoever sent it didn't guess. They knew. And that was the part that didn't make sense. Daniel had spent years making sure there were no loose ends. Every complaint buried, every deal cleaned, every mistake erased before it could grow into a problem. That was how he stayed in control. That was how he built his position. So how could a quiet, irrelevant old man suddenly become a threat? It didn't add up. And Daniel hated things that didn't add up. Across the street, Walter sat exactly where he always did, holding that same chipped mug, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. But this time, there was no emptiness in his eyes. There was intention. Quiet, patient intention. He wasn't watching the neighborhood anymore. He was watching Daniel, like a man observing the beginning of something he had already planned the end of. Daniel broke eye contact first. Not out of fear, but out of discomfort he couldn't explain. And that small moment was the first crack in the control he believed he had. By noon, the second message came. This time, it wasn't just a warning. It was a detailed but a precise one. A transaction from 8 years ago, a property Daniel had forced into foreclosure through pressure and manipulation, then quietly transferred through a third party before selling it at triple the value. Something no one had ever questioned. Something no one had ever traced. Except now, someone had. Daniel stared at his phone, his jaw tightening, his thoughts racing faster than his composure could keep up. This wasn't random. This wasn't luck. This was targeted. Someone had access to information that didn't exist publicly. Someone had been watching longer than he realized. And deep down, he already knew who it was, but he refused to accept it. Because accepting it meant admitting that he had underestimated someone. And Daniel Mercer didn't make that kind of mistake. Or at least, he never had before. That afternoon, he called an emergency HOA meeting. Not because he needed approval, but because he needed control back. The room filled quickly. Neighbors sitting straight, attentive, ready to agree like they always did. Daniel stood at the front, confident, composed, delivering his usual speech about community standards and maintaining property value. But there was something different in his tone, sharper. More aggressive. Like he was trying to convince himself as much as everyone else. And then, the door opened. No knock. No hesitation. Just a slow, deliberate push. Every head in the room turned at the same time. Walter Hayes stepped inside. Same jacket. Same calm expression. But the energy he carried was completely different. He didn't look like someone who had come to defend himself. He looked like someone who had come to end something. Daniel's voice stopped mid-sentence. The room went silent. Walter didn't ask for permission. Didn't greet anyone. He simply walked forward, each step steady, controlled, until he reached the center of the room. Then he spoke. You should have stopped when you had the chance. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every word landed with weight. Daniel forced a laugh, trying to regain control. This isn't your place. You're already removed. Walter cut him off gently. No, not yet. And then, he placed a folder on the table. The same kind of folder Daniel had spent years making sure never existed. Inside it, were copies. Documents. Photos. Evidence. Not accusations. Proof. Clear, undeniable, organized proof. The room shifted instantly. The same people who had trusted Daniel without question now leaned forward, eyes scanning, expressions changing. Confusion turning into doubt. Doubt turning into realization. And Daniel felt it happen in real time. That control he built so carefully, slipping. Not all at once. But enough. Enough to matter. This is fake, Daniel said quickly, but his voice didn't carry the same authority anymore. Walter tilted his head slightly. Then you won't mind if it gets verified. That's when the third message hit Daniel's phone. This time, it wasn't from an unknown number. It was from a contact he recognized instantly. A lawyer. One he hadn't heard from in years. The message was short. We need to talk. Immediately. Daniel didn't open it fully. He didn't need to. Because he understood what it meant. This wasn't just exposure. This was collapse. A chain reaction he couldn't stop. And for the first time, the man who controlled everything, had no control left. The meeting ended in chaos. Voices raised. Questions fired. People leaving their seats, whispering, arguing, demanding answers Daniel couldn't give. The perfect system he built, breaking apart in minutes. And Walter didn't stay to watch. He turned, walked out the same way he came in, calm, steady, unaffected. Because this was never about revenge in the way people understood it. It wasn't anger. It wasn't impulse. It was patience. Years of it. The kind of patience that doesn't react, it waits. Outside, the air felt different. Lighter. Not for the neighborhood, but for Walter. He walked back to his house slowly, like always. Sat down on his chair. Took a sip of his coffee. And looked at the street one more time. But this time, he wasn't watching ghosts. He was watching consequences. Over the next few days, everything Daniel had built unraveled faster than anyone thought possible. Investigations opened. Properties frozen. Accounts questioned. People who once stood beside him suddenly stepped away, protecting themselves. Because loyalty only exists when power does. And Daniel had lost his. Completely. By the end of the week, the same house he tried to take from Walter was the only place left untouched. No notices. No warnings. No threats. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes after something finishes exactly the way it was meant to. And on the final morning, as the neighborhood tried to return to normal, one thing was clear. Walter Hayes was never the weak old man they thought he was. He was the one thing they never accounted for. Not because he was loud. Not because he fought back. But because he understood something they didn't. Control isn't about force. It's about timing. And Walter had perfect timing.